Hello everyone, today we talk about Romanization and barbarization in Europe between the 6th and the 7th century. This intro actually doesn't have too much to do as a definition with the actual topic of the video that will develop along the way. In fact, I prepared these videos early on. I became efficient enough to store them in advance of even 2 months so far, so that I have also enough time along the way to mature certain concepts regarding, in fact, the type of message, the actual meaning of the video, a bit more over time and refining it a little bit. That concerns mostly a comparison between the Latin-Germanic world and mostly the Byzantine one. We could extend this as far as the dependency or the action, dependency on or the simple action of the Byzantine Church extends, even though in these centuries specifically, the 6th and 7th, mostly we witnessed to a contraction. It wasn't much of an evangelization that the Byzantines made, contrarily to what the Roman papacy, together with the Latin-Germanic powers, was doing in the West. And this is already actually a massive chapter that is heading towards the broader meaning, because we could extend this, and we've seen it very often, especially if you check the Evangelization of Europe playlist out, very far. Right? I made recently a video, for example, about the overwhelming expansion of Western civilization during the 13th century, in which we discussed, in fact, the limits of the Byzantine and the Arab worlds, but also the Turco-Mongolian one at that point. It's not that this message doesn't get received or understood. However, I have the impression that in this specific time in history, and for reasons that I will completely avoid to digress on because they would open up yet another immense chapter, I'm not going to do so, brought to a sort of essentially revaluation of, for example, the Byzantine Orthodox world as a sort of essentially rejection of essentially the projection that self-sabotaging Western people do of today's West on the actual, or in this case, early medieval West, that is not just wrong for present times, but it's even more wrong actually for those, right? And in part, this actually embraces yet another immense issue that is connected with it, and it is a bit the so-called Dark Legion that I would extend in this sense to the concept of the early Middle Ages that we call the Dark Ages. I know that the Black Legion is something else, but in a way it goes in parallel with the criticism towards the Middle Ages as a whole, all right? And so all the topics that we intensely discuss regarding Catholicism, as you know, even before Christianity, and how, in the case of this video, actually intertwine with the contraction of the very Catholic Empire in, of course, in the expectation that we have, however, still knowing what will happen later, re-expansion of the system, and essentially the undebatable, macroscopical, and uncontrovertible victory of the West on basically any other system existing in the European continent, in the Mediterranean, and even far beyond. I do not intend to digress on this either, because I should make, if anything, other videos explaining, I don't know, medieval history for dummies, why the Middle Ages were not at all a backward period, and that today we'll address in part, at least considering the timeline that we have given here, 6th to 7th century, but also in again, in hindsight, considering what happened later. Because not just the Latin-Germanic world boomed at every level, political, militarily, socially, but of course it was endowed with a specific Catholic ethos that had been importantly correcting even some aspects of the manifestation of Christianity that surely was influenced by other currents that lived in other parts of Christendom, others that were lost to the Arabs, that were very distant from Western Europe, and or that, for example, were developed in the Byzantine world. And we're not talking just Christianity here, but especially the relation between the empire and the church. I do not need, fortunately, to introduce this topic either. There is a Renovatio Imperii and Investiture Controversy playlist that deals with that. Admittedly, we did not discuss much the relation between the Byzantine emperor and the Byzantine church. We saw this mostly in comparison with the West, and especially the sort of incredibly brutal and ultimately unsuccessful attempts of Constantinople to have any kind of control on the papacy that eventually got mostly to the other way around. At least not just the papacy emancipated it quite early on from any kind of secular power, but it began to, during the Fourth Crusade, under Innocent III, the peak of Roman Catholicism in Christian times, because again, there are pre-Christian Catholic times, even though some of you come up saying, but I've never heard of this. Well, okay, I can't digress on it either at every video. I made plenty of videos on that. Just check that out. Brought to the overrunning of the same Constantinople, even the attempt, admittedly unsuccessful one, to reunite the church as a whole, but that in fact gets often misunderstood in this sense. Oh, okay, they failed because there's still an Orthodox world. That's not. First of all, we should be extremely careful about the terminology. The Orthodox Church is officially known as entitled as Catholic Church. I don't know if you know that, but Catholic is the only type of church that can exist by definition. Of course, anything after Protestant Reformation, formed after Protestant Reformation, by definition, I don't even say it, but you understand perfectly what it is by a very specific concept that is inherent Catholicism and what is not Catholicism. What today I want to see, without complicating things further as an intro, is how Romanity actually went on living much more powerfully and strongly, contrary to popular opinion, in the Latin-Germanic West and not in the Byzantine world. If by Romanity we truly understand the exclusive metaphysical centrality of Rome in the history of mankind and the cosmos. So what the Byzantines themselves were claiming to have the monopoly on, for essentially legalistic reasons at the end of the day. They were pointing to the simply secular political continuity of this. The church in itself was a completely different matter, because if anything, Rome was Rome and not Constantinople, and whatever was attempted to even remotely come to challenge this notion shipwrecked dramatically. And I suggest you watch my Christian history videos, because I see that you regularly don't watch them. And we all very much know that you do not know absolutely anything about ecclesiological history, and that I'm as well the only channel making actual ecclesiological history on YouTube, which also explains in part as a broader pop culture, subcultural indicator that nobody knows ecclesiastical history, including people who try to make it on YouTube for reasons that are not the ones I come from with. So, if anything, you cannot understand anything in the history of mankind if you do not study the history of the church. And not what you think the history of the church is, but what the history of the church actually is. Which, believe me, are two radically different things. And believe me, I do know what you think in general, of course. Some of you get it, but tendentially you don't. The sense of this all, of course, is that not just there is an objective indicator of such Roman continuity in Western Europe compared to the Byzantine world that you should always consider as Roman in its own regard. I made multiple videos on this topic. You perfectly know that I make lots of Byzantine history. I like it, but I'm also not the guy with, and there are lots of reasons there that simply talk Byzantine history because they think it's the edgy, cool stuff to say, to tell other people no, that they weren't called Byzantines, they were called Roman kind of approach, which is at most what just, I think, a 22-year-old, 23 is just too old, can't make, just to sound authoritative at to any traceable degree. Then you age, and you actually grow up, your prefrontal cortex solidifies, and you start understanding a lot. But also the fact that the Byzantine Empire, and this is something truly underrated at so many also scholarly levels, not just, yes, had a crisis like the entire system had. So I'm not blaming just the Byzantine Empire for being the Byzantine Empire. Actually, there are some aspects during the 6th to 7th century are very good, civilizationally speaking, about Constantinople that also allows them to survive in spite of the loss essentially of one half of its territory at the Islamic hands. It also means something anyway, but also the Visigoth crumbled in the west, so we must, even in that case, make lots of distinctions. It's not that easy. But that essentially the Byzantine Empire barbarized from the within. This latter aspect, in the true sense of departure from Roman standards, is, I would say, one of the single most underrated ones that I've literally never heard anyone discussing. Surely historiographically this has been pointed out, but I do not know any specific work that, aside from grasping it from, I don't know, studying other things, mostly about Balkan history, but we could extend it to other regions, were, of course, realizing that the countryside was becoming something extremely different from what it had been in antiquity, and especially in Roman and not Hellenic times, and we will explain why. Right? There is a huge also void, I would say, in the perception of how much Latinity, the Italic element, was strong in what we call conventionally that eastern part of the empire, that is essentially the Balkans, the Danubian region, the Illyricum, because, and this is not just showed by, I don't know, Romania or some words, in many words actually in Serbo-Croatian, etc., that and during this time, before, say, mostly like the Slavic migrations, other issues, every time I make a video on that, there's somebody saying, no, they did not exist, whatever. Like, I'm not even discussing that, made plenty of videos on that. Actually were Latin Romance, at least in culture, linguistically, and also ethnically in that linguistic sense, and not Hellenic. So the idea of this preponderance of a Byzantine, say Eastern Roman world that would have been sort of so compactly strong and monolithic and hardcore and resisting and whatever, actually, and so that eventually emerges as a sort of Hellenic, non-Western, or even anti-Western, and mutually, in that sense, reciprocated in terms of competition world that today's people also pick as, no, that's not the West, it was such a more traditional world that was so much better. How? Nobody really understands, considering what happened to it, also macroscopically. And if you do not know what I'm talking about, I don't know, do you even history? Do you have any kind of idea of what we're discussing? I will make other videos, and today we'll also address it if you need to be reminded. At the hands of the West, there was a guy, for example, in the last video I made on the overwhelming expansion of Western civilization during the 13th century, that asked, I hope naively, but something like, but can't this be, first of all, he said something like, isn't this just like the affirmation of feudalism? Well, ask the Italian communes, ask the ANSA, ask this is a very particular aspect of the West, as we will see now, is radically discriminating this idea of this alleged Byzantine superiority, that the Byzantine system sclerotized any kind of autonomy. You do not have communes, you do not have parallel sort of cultural developments, local autonomies, not in a fragmentary sense, but truly in the nurturing way that you have in the West. In the West, you have, yes, in the 13th century, the peak of feudalism, accompanied by the parallel development of communal liberties, of the general expansion of the system at every level, right? Something that is not sclerotic by definition, and definitely the opposite of what was happening in the Byzantine world. And it's not even, by the way, and I discussed this in the video about the Komnenoi, that some enlightened Byzantine emperor did not realize what was going on and tried to westernize the system. Indeed, it was too much of a task to be accomplished even by just great rulers, because of, however, the resistance of Byzantine history that has been also legitimately seen by that point as not this sort of there were Romans parrot kind of essentially self-parody. I don't know what that is even supposed to mean in that sort of. It's the only thing that these people know by about Byzantine history or culture. But the fact that it was obviously a continuation of Greek culture, and or, of course, one that had undergone significant change and transformation from ancient to medieval times. Medieval Greek is not ancient Greek, etc. But more or less, we're talking about the same the same channel. We're talking about the same legacy, just as you could say that, I don't know, that the Latin Italic culture eventually became Italian. You can't say that the Germans of the ancient world, aside from chunks of them that migrated everywhere, are still ethnically like the same continuity of those ones. So it's completely normal. And we know this also from an ethnogenetical point of view. This starts actually being less true in certain parts of Central and Eastern Europe, as we'll see also the Balkans. That's the actual problem, that Byzantine culture is a very urban coastal and sort of basic secluded reality. All right, this is actually the greatest marker of indicator of continuity with ancient Hellenic culture, that the Greeks did not see anything beyond their own polis district. Right, this is pretty notorious. This is what the cornerstone of the Byzantine Empire was established on. You can see it pretty much everywhere across the Mediterranean. You can start seeing it, even especially in comparison with the West, in countries like Italy that notoriously had the Byzantine avamposts up to a certain point, while actually developing national kingdoms in their own local ethnic and Byzantine separated ways. I made a video, for example, on Rome between the two Ostrogothic sieges and the Latin-Germanic ties against the Byzantines. So, as I said before, I'm not going to digress yet again on why we write, just like the specialists in the field that call themselves Byzantinists still, and are the same people who are telling you why, of course, the Byzantines were Romans, that it's not a heresy to use the term Byzantine, because it's an incredibly important reminder that no, there was no equality. There had never actually been, even within the Roman Empire. People, this ideas, as you know, stem, I said it many times, from this strange populistic hysteria and phobia of power. This notion that everybody under that empire was actually just sort of a brain dead, a bot that went out committing genocide or whatever, and that do not understand the heavy hierarchy of cultural inferiority and superiority that not just antiquity, but even more the Middle Ages forces you mandatorily and violently to considerate, without, of course, any relevance of whatever your otherwise subjective opinion is, because we should start teaching people that having an opinion doesn't mean this having any value whatsoever. Right? They're two very different things, right? They can overlap, especially most of the times they don't. So much to discuss. Let's go a bit by order. Just a couple of concepts, but they deserve great attention. First of all, general notice that I already gave you here. There's a narrative that would like essentially to deny the existence of objective ethno-cultural characters when speaking of groups, peoples, and nations. It's always the issue of half full, half empty glass that I've never been interested in discussing. I mean, if you have some historical evidence, understanding, knowledge, you're able to criticize, to analyze, you can easily assess from a historical point of view at large what kind of ethnocultural characters a given people at a certain time have. Denying it by saying, well, we're talking essentially about such, composite groups, even though we do not even know how they were technically composed. I mean, yes, we know, ethnically speaking, that they were the result of a migration era mixing, etc. But outside of that, aside from the fact that the old sort of mythologies and myths of the origin proper, ethnogenesis, etc., are fairly well explained by even just the documentary evidence. Right? Archaeology does not actually help us more than much at all, simply because it doesn't have tags, and without documentary history, it's practically worthless. And considering the many things that were happening at the time, so not merely this staticity of a people. That is exactly what you should challenge if you're claiming that these peoples were not sort of culturally cohesive to begin with. Pertains mostly to the migration era phase. But aside from the fact that we do have a pretty concrete idea of what kind of ethnicity most of these people technically were, things start becoming admittedly more complicated when you look at the steps, but also in there, generally speaking, we know, and even if we didn't, they were so similar to one another out there, nomadically wise, that does it even make much of a difference to begin with? And again, altogether, we even know, right, through also thanks to archaeology, through ethnogenetics and so on, who they were, more or less, and knowing it to a greater degree of precision doesn't actually change anything about what we study and appreciate historically, aside from this sort of obsession for relativism. We cannot really say, we do not know, we have to be careful, which at the end of the day means always there is someone who's going to essentially stirred us into some sort of propaganda or mythology or whatever. Yes, we all know, we are very well accomplished roaming the internet, that there are, paranoid peoples, countries, and cultures that do not know absolutely anything about their own history, were radically undereducated, and they have to be constantly loud and outspoken about their own mental disturbances / pseudo-historical fabrications. But we rest in Western civilization on pretty radically sound historiographical knowledge, notion, and history, that it's not like, again, a mentally marginated person has any power of altering, unless you want to be altered by that, which makes you in that group as well. So let's trash immediately any kind of concern about this stuff. When we talk especially about the settlement after the the migration era, that admittedly in Eastern Europe lasted longer, right? So talking here roughly Eastern, Western, of course there is a specifically Western, Central, Eastern, there are the Balkans, there is Southwestern Europe. We understand that, in fact, as being there very positively defined and historically confirmed, not that there was ever a doubt whatsoever, especially in the West, in Western Europe to begin with, ethno-cultural identities that we can even at this point start discussing in terms of national, proto-national. I mean, proto-national, if you're so scared of using the term, not of course the kind of nationalism or ethno-nationalism or statal nationalism, etc., that we know better from the 19th century, but of course what natio means in Latin, what fundamentally became conventionally to use in everyday language. So that's always the problem. If you start undermining the same notions of conventional language, well, you can't put everything to discussion except running in circles. That is exactly that mental disorder, paranoia, and general lack of orientation and awareness substantiates itself of. And it's not a surprise that, of course, in parallel with the spread of mental illnesses, of lack of purpose, etc., like historiography mirrors what would like to mirror that. Aside from the fact that there is fortunately an elite that consistently maintains an actual moral and scientific level of standard, and one part of the world academia can go insane, but there is another that is completely normal, actually. And speaking from a continentally European background, I can tell you that we should also recover, also in this case, a pretty drastically rigid idea of academic superiority and inferiority. I mean, where I come from, even though we had in the West, we had communists as a party that, infiltrated the universities, whatever, that never took over. Like, even our liberal scholars do not engage in sort of Marxistic nonsense just per se, and are actually good from a qualitative point of view. So if you've never been aware that this word exists, it's simply because for some reason people think that sometimes their own cultural reality stops to a very narrow confine that is by itself the most blatant denial, in fact, of a Catholic culture, and that's where you're going to end up stuck in if you do not know better. And you will be overrun, because things that work, and those don't, right? So this is important, and it also, of course, means that these groups, peoples, and nations that settled during the migration era were not, however, all alike. Not just in the sense that, of course, the Merovingian kingdom was different from the Lombard one, or Visigothic one was different from the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, etc. But that there is actually a major divide between the Romano-Germanic kind of dominion and polities and kingdoms regionally extended in scale to what was happening in the eastern part of the continent, where you have essentially a Byzantine Empire that is, yes, also statally, culturally, politically, the major continuation, at least in the legal claim of the imperial continuity of the Roman Empire, and that, however, does not exclude, as we will see now, actual Romanity continuing even more successfully, especially on the longer run in the West, which is instead what is constantly challenged by different reasons. Remember that many people will fixate with the Byzantine Empire just skirting civilization in many ways, and there are sometimes the same people who, are hyper obsessed about, the Norse going to fight in Constantinople, finding this sort of contemporary connections that are not just incredibly idiotic, but that we understand exactly what they refer to also, and that can unmask any reason behind that kind of pseudo-historical thinking, and completely ignore what was the by far more advanced Western European world, that is especially the more, surely what will be the more debated notion that I'm portraying here, because as it is completely normal, if you've been raised as a kid to pretend that essentially Western Europe was just a cluster of smoky, stinky mud huts, just like in the most, I don't even know how to say that, darkistic, narrowly northwestern European, most miserable side of the story, you will never understand. Obviously, because we should be extremely honest about this. Most cultural, historical indicators regarding properly the awareness of medieval history stem in a good half of the Western world exclusively from that idea. Right? That means to say there's been a massive medieval civilization that you have been essentially being removed from the scene because of mostly, this is post-Reformation anti-Catholic propaganda, and generally narrow, sort of very islander, in that sense, also heading towards itself, in spite of being Western, paranoid, isolationistic, narcissistic aestheticization, and also at the same time, of course, puritanic self-hatred to some degree, because that's always, these are incredibly characteristic psychological features of medieval, high and late medieval heresies, by the way. I don't want to stress that too much, but this is the point. It's as if you were evaluating literally the single least developed, populated, interconnected part of Western Europe to some of the more developed in essentially just the Byzantine Empire. And there is a debate there, even I, for example, have an enormous admiration for the Anglo-Saxons and Anglo-Saxon culture, and especially during the early Middle Ages, right? There is even this aspect that it's not like you are looking at that in a way that you appreciate what was actually being salvaged, for example, from previous times, of what was being accomplished in connection with Rome. Never mind Rome. Little detail in the evangelization of the West, in what is in theory total anarchy, like the pretty orderly and coordinated evangelization of the entire West under a single spiritual guidance and hegemony by mutual consensus of all the parts, and also in the few cases in which this was actually the conquest of some, I can think just of Saxony, telling the truth, in a sense that actually wasn't really Christianity versus what we also ridiculously call paganism, which also in the so-called pagan world was actually a Catholic culture, as we explain so often, so many videos. You are, and let's not talk about, in fact, the Black Legion at all. Sure, it has nothing to do with that. Every place in the world believes that they are actually they have the best academia. They have sorted everything out and whatever, except that there is an actual difference between those who have guessed this right and those who have guessed it wrong, or better or worse than the other. And yes, even incredibly developed parts of the world today do not actually have the pillars of the imperial Catholic / Roman culture that was the pride of the superiority of Western civilization in early medieval times, because they have been specifically and surgically trained to believe that it must not be, not just that it didn't have, that it wasn't, let's say, but that it couldn't be. Because if you deny that there was such universal spectrum and unity, you essentially are undermining what you've been brainwashed to be the only thing that matters in your ridiculous national and this sense fourth estate national statal confines of post-traditional sub-cultures, again, that emerged just a couple of hundred of years ago in explicit hatred against tradition, which do not even know what it is. The problem is that say a massive amount of historiography that has colonially also spread to other countries in the world, and so made even more damage in terms of polluted minds, has been built over this idea. And so it's not easy just to come out here and say, well, okay, now we fixed it, we have found it out. No, this is not how it works. Many people have an incredibly childish idea of how the academia works. There is not a guy that sorts out a mathematical formula and everybody says, okay, it's right, so from today we'll start thinking like that. Historiography does not work like that. It has incredibly long times of resistance, incredibly narrow confines in many branches that are individually considered as also important. Historians, not just historians or archaeologists or philologists or whatever, that actually have absolutely nothing to do with history. Let's stress this, and we must be extremely honest about this to begin with, because this pauperism of we were so in the dark ages and whatever has prompted people to say, well, history is useless. Let's look at materialism, because archaeology will sort things out. Archaeology does not sort anything out. The entire story that we know, it's because we have narrative documentary sources of sort. Archaeology does not do that. And it can't, right? There's not a time in the future in which these other branches will substitute in terms of evidence what happened and will not work with documentary sources anymore. It doesn't work like that. But in any case, there is no worse stupid than he who does not want to understand. And of course, there are many reasons why a person may not want to understand, including the ones that I just listed. According to you, why do YouTube videos about ethno-tribal stuff get many more views than actual civilization videos about major chapters like, I don't know, Carolingian Europe, same history of the church, medieval France, medieval Italy, medieval Spain? But you make, maybe because a video game's come out that wants to portray the sort of the feministic mental disturbances of medieval fantasy, pseudo recreations of what specifically underdeveloped countries were during the Middle Ages. We live in this kind of world. Civilization paralyzes mentally the lesser human being, because lesser people are perfectly aware of the fact that they are so because they screwed up even in civilization, and that if you present them with civilizational standards about their own failure, their own lack of power, that is the primary indicator of the imperial Catholic culture, they are annihilated, and so they have to make up these other essentially invented a historical and anti-historical realities, let's call it like this, in order to essentially arrive to the grave in a way in which their psychosis will have not been too painful. This is literally how it is. I'm not saying this because I have any particular point to make or because I'm not critical of practically anything else that I can discuss, but this is the world in which we live, historically wise. I'm not even going to start on what people actually learn, because it's not about the content, it's probably about the process. And no, there is also nothing better than what we have in the West outside of it. Other countries do not study literally anything. Passing, let's say, having educational achievements in passing from radically illiterate peoples into mass schooling is not an achievement. It's telling you how individually intelligent these people are, right? Especially lesser people confuse the concept of education, schooling, whatever, with this basic post-traditional failing subcultural forms of pseudo-education, and even in those cases in which this would be the great accomplishments, actually they correspond with the countries with the least proficiency, with the least valuable actual titles on the market. And that means something extremely specific, of course. If you wonder why I'm talking about this, it's because it started from here. Because in Europe, there was an actual divide between two areas that, especially medieval, I mean, actually far beyond, because the thing was established in medieval times, and so that's why it's more important, right, to look at the Middle Ages. Of course, if you talk about modern contemporary history, it's even more self-evident, macroscopically so, even though paranoia brings to cognitive dissonance and denial, and we all know how it works. But if you do not understand how it even started, you're admitted not to know the reason why this divide existed to begin with. In this sense, that self-spitting, self-sabotaging of, say, we were in the Dark Ages, let's now, just because a multiculturalistic, decadent society of the 1980s, the 1990s, told us, oh, look, they were the Byzantines, we didn't notice them, which is also BS, because actually we always studied them. It's just that because of that aforementioned nationalist, statalist paranoia, of course, people had fixated too much on their own provincial mentality to understand anything about their own people at the time. They began to shift focus from a liberal socialistic point of view on this perennially decadent / non-decadent, multicultural, late antique, apparently culturally and morally ambiguous reality that in part also really was, as the single most important thing that ever happened historically, and that only truly intelligent, educated people know and care about. Right? I don't know in those decades how many, or still to the tens of the third millennium, I stopped counting them, how many publications on Constantine occurred. In a way that it's not, say, that Constantine is not important, or that, of course, you shouldn't keep thinking or reconsidering this, but if you look at the amount of books that were printed, also considering their quality, it makes you cry about the poor forest, destroyed just for such completely useless garbage, compared to other major civilizational topics like, I don't know, the Holy Roman Empire, the French monarchy, the Italian communes, etc., that instead did not receive any of the same organic, repetitive, and intensive attention. Also, fortunately, in a sense, because if the authors were there are like 3-4 sources on Constantine. Let's be honest about this. You can't talk, of course, about the broader empire. There are many more sources, but it's not that you can't eternally focus on such figures, unless there is, of course, some sort of fixation in the presence that is mirrored by this incredible concentration. Constantine will always and must always be studied, but there are also many other important things to be studied that go beyond this period. There's also the entire issue of we shouldn't make people too interested in the migration era, because from, say, nationalism, romanticism in the 19th century, uneducated fourth estaters began to think that essentially it was them. They began to self-identify, also to make up for that lack, of course, of value that is particularly stark exactly in comparison with their ancestors at the time, to hide the same, just that the paradox. And so let's not actually care too much about the Romano-Germanic kingdoms that are actually also studied. That is not to say that they are neglected, but in a pop culture sense, are just anecdotally brought up. We should be extremely serious about this. I mean, it's extremely, on YouTube you can find everything about, I don't know, the Byzantine army, the Byzantine soldier, the Byzantine whatever. How much there is about Merovingian Francia, or about the Visigothic kingdom, or the Longobards, or the same Anglo-Saxons outside of the sort of pre-packed repetition in the sort of pseudo kind of documentary TV mode, right, of narration. There is actually not much. And even when there is, it's this incredibly shallow, uncritical, also generally speaking, uninformed and secluding kind of presentation. Like, say, these were these people's focus just on them individually and do not consider what was actually happening within them, among them. Because don't even try to feel challenged about the notion that these peoples had actually a common center in universal ambition, if anything of domination, and that were actually living in the wake of waking, as we'll see now, in the legacy of Romanity, or better, in actual Romanity in itself. That none of them actually thought that the Roman Empire was over, in the sense we also been told, like, there is the end of the Western Roman Empire in the West, and so there something else changes irreparably, or without any continuity, with this radical fracture with the no. And especially the more important and developed countries in this scenario were actually the ones that have a striking continuity throughout from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages and beyond, and keep to put out an insane amount of culture that keeps essentially Romanizing the entire system, and in which the same feudal world actually develops. There is an incredible resistance, believe me, against these topics. Because, as you understand here, both the leftists and the rightists, I don't know how to say that, converge towards that subnormal level of individual cultural and collective cultural inferiority, more importantly. Because they are the reflection of one another. They're post-traditional human sewage that we can't even sometimes qualify like this anymore, because the standards have even sunk further down. And so history has just become practically nothing, especially in the pop cultural world that allegedly makes disclosure and information and all this stuff. Passing to the second topic, as we were just saying, not all the migrations were the same, not all the peoples who settled were the same, but there is a major divide, especially between Latin-Germanic Europe and the rest of Europe. I don't think we need to go through that, because this video is already pretty long by itself, but I made so many videos about Latin-Germanic Europe, about the Byzantine world, about the Slavs, that we know more or less what we're talking about just by conventional literacy. And again, if you don't have that, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to explain myself further. Just click. Don't be passively fed by YouTube algorithm. Search for content, and the gates of heaven will be open to you. Now that's I do not subscribe to that last part, but it was just to bait the mentally feeble. In any case, in the part of this, the latter part of the migration era during the 6th, the 7th century, which is a very, again, Western timing for the end of the migration era, things are very movemented in the East, which is yet another reason why things were sort of much worse there to begin with. And never make the silly confusion of thinking that just because a system is bigger is qualitatively more powerful than another. Never, right? This is actually true in absolute terms. Look at the same Romano-Germanic kingdoms compared to late medieval kingdoms. Of course, the latter were disproportionately more powerful. Also, the high medieval ones in general. So that apparent political fragmentation, which we also bring as an obsessive thought, comparative thought from 19th century Victorian maps of different countries, neatly shaped, colored with different tones, supposing that the absolutely radical categorical divide from one another, and considering smaller things less powerful, because that was the message inherently behind that kind of mentality, do not apply. The sense of Catholic power goes beyond, of course, spiritually such things, and it's exactly that pneuma that we have had recently the chance of discussing in those videos, especially about the Germanic Imperial Catholic miracle. Also the one I made the other day about the Germanic Volkschaft actually takes that into consideration. The Byzantines had their, as you know, fair shrinking. It's not just, as we will see now, a matter of territory, it's a matter of what was happening in within. And never think also that the migration era is just like, a happy moment for anyone, right? People who were moving so because they were in panic, in desperation. It's not because they were wealthy or stable. They were doing it exactly for the opposite reason. So even when they score an important result, they mostly get assimilated into a different condition, and especially in the most stable part of Europe, they actually continue the legacy of the previous civilization. They are actually subsumed by the same. This is why, for example, the Romano-Germanic kingdoms were that successful in historical hindsight. The Visigothic kingdom was also promising in many ways, but there were some characteristics of it that were much more markedly Byzantine or Byzantine imitating by their own specific will, right? The councils of Toledo, for example, imitating the ones of Constantinople, challenging Rome a bit. The real axis that gets formed is truly papacy, Franks, Anglo-Saxons, Longobards, and then all these other peoples that these pieces of, the same Frankish Empire that, especially along the Rhine and the Danube, get consolidated and form a great part of what we mean as Western Europe. Then essentially Spain will re-enter that after hundreds of years of Islamic domination, because it was this great Frankish push that reinvigorated the local Christian survivors and making them retake over what had been essentially just their own peers now under somebody else's rule, and very much changed, admittedly, but still part of a Western, in that case especially Iberian world that was not in that sense Arab in a essential sense at all. Even though, of course, there is an important change there that places Spain in a very different condition than the one of the rest of Western Europe. However, we see in the 6th and the 7th centuries that are also the ones in which most things are settled for the incoming half of a millennium, or shortly less, depending on what kind of indicators you want to provide. Actually, already since the 8th century, there's a revival, right? The Middle Ages are constant expansion for most of the entire system. The only moments of contraction were the 7th, say the second half of the 6th, the 7th, and essentially the mid 14th century. The rest is not just expansion, but an expansion that in relative terms to the means of the time is literally unknown historically. What the West did throughout the Middle Ages is not where to be seen anywhere else. And unfortunately, even though, for example, the Byzantine Empire was very robust and powerful and still part of definitely of that European world, it was not comparable. Especially if you consider that the West was this cluster of different polities, so that if you have to draw a line, you could use that. Those, even though they're different polities, they're very similar. They have sort of a very different history. Sometimes they may have century more, century less for certain dynamics, but they also work cohesively as a post-Frankish system, essentially. But the dynamics that are radically important here in the 6th and the 7th century are the following. From one side, we have the Romanization of the barbarians. Where does this happen, according to you? Because the Romanization of the barbarians was the hallmark of Romanity since ever in the Imperial Catholic providential and evangelical guys. Even before Christianity, of course, the mandate of world domination, of elevation of the lesser into the greater, and the compaction of divine power. But the average person, I don't know, because of course I have a very different mentality in this regard, but the average person would say the Romanization of the barbarians tastes as Theodosian, tastes as, even Justinian, looking at all the mercenaries, the foreign mercenaries that existed there. Even though this is such a very well-known thing to point out, it seems that nobody in a pop cultural sense, or whatever you could define it, minimally considers in the Romanization of the barbarians the unchallengebly macroscopical and superior dynamic taking place in Latin-Germanic Europe, which is called Latin-Germanic Europe exactly because of that. They used to say that the Byzantines did not have any power to Romanize barbarians. Again, we have to understand also what it means to Romanize, and that's where the civilizational divide that points out to how much more advanced and successful already in these very centuries the West really was, is proven exactly at this point. You can't have a Kuman from the steppe that you hire as a mercenary and that maybe you even allow to settle on the frontier of the empire in, the mouth of the Danube. That is a place where no civilized Byzantine would ever set foot, if not for military occupation or garrison needs. Right? One thing is having an entire people, Germanic people, that settles in a Roman world that is also essentially subordinate, because the Germans are the staunch minority, especially the most civilly advanced of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, that start legislating in Latin as a truly Romano-Germanic kingdom, right? Not something that, is just temporary or to pass, right? The Bulgarian Empire, there is an ethnic continuity from the first, the second, we've seen it, but let's say it's not that the Bulgarian Empire leaves a state. They tried to do that. They tried to copy Constantinople, but they were essentially crumbling and incredibly privatistic. So we'll see now what happened in the Balkans compared, because we've all been told, right, that the eastern part of the empire survived because it was so well better placed, that it was richer, it was more advanced, it was more urbanized, it was more economically thriving. Well, actually, the most urbanized part of the former Roman Empire was the West. The largest cities, with the only exception of Constantinople, and we will explain why, it was just a few hectares larger than Rome, by the way, were in the West. Ravenna, Verona, etc. There were also big centers like, Aphrodisias or Antioch, but pretty much that fabric of urbanization in the Byzantine world collapses. In the West, urbanization had definitely undergone massive challenges. It is true that in places like Britain or northern France, urbanization suffers a very heavy blow. But telling the truth, and especially in France, that urban continuity is constant in the main Roman centers. Also in England, essentially, that remains the same. And the kingdoms that developed from, also and especially from the rest of Gaul, Italy, Spain, are actual kingdoms ruling from actual cities with an actual institutional unity. That especially is preserved over the centuries. We are all aware, say, of the issues that the Merovingians had. At some point, the Frankish kingdom was actually split in four, even though we should point out that it was actually just two. If we speak the Frankish kingdom, Neustria, Austrasia, Neustria remaining in the Roman part, and post-Roman part, Romance area, the most developed and advanced, the place where everything would be retained in terms of power and where France would develop from, etc. and the other chunks actually being Burgundy and Aquitaine, that were also in part like territories developing from, yes, at least in the case of Burgundy, from a Germanic migration, but that were overlapping notoriously and consistently Roman provinces and administration and Urbanism and so on. Actually, the Burgundians, specifically with the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, have the single most Romanized of the Germanic laws, and also as a consequence the more advanced, and the one that essentially equates civilly, because at least the law addresses everyone, the Romans and the Germans practically. Even in those contexts of greater fragmentation, like Anglo-Saxon England, for example, that is the liminal case, you see actually a Germanic superiority on the basis of a post-Roman reality that manages to push out the, in part the post-Roman, but already Celtic blended, or already to begin with, this was a Romano-Brittonic word. They weren't just the Romans, right? And that on the fringe, and then actually gets evangelized from Rome, or at least it gets evangelized from the Saint Celts, which is a paradox because those had actually converted and doing all this together with Rome, at least in part, or from Rome, anywhere from the remaining faithful essentially to the Catholic Church and the Roman primacy of honor and charity. Eventually, with Gregory the Great, the same Anglo-Saxons convert to the Roman rather than the Celtic Christian model of administration, but again, it's the same Catholic system. There's no essential difference in that regard, and start actually building kingdoms that are, by the 11th century, it takes a long time indeed, but still they were, by that point, one of some single most administratively advanced systems in Europe. The same Normans that are essentially a Western Frankish product in the conquest of England actually graft themselves quite comfortably on that system that holds and that has the upper hand also in the British archipelago, so also in places that had not technically been Roman before in terms of direct contact and occupation. But indeed, if you look at especially Italy, Spain, and Gaul, and this is where the wide majority of European wealth, population, etc., will remain concentrated during the Middle Ages, because let's be honest, Constantinople is mostly just the Byzantine culture around, we will see it better now, around the coasts. All right. The hinterland is a completely different reality, and everything that is essentially east of what had been, or north than the Roman world, is a overwhelmingly underpopulated, underconnected, and also just poorer world, and especially the one that Constantinople will actually manage to keep for herself during the evangelization, meaning that the Western Slavs, as you know, will fall under Roman Catholicism. It's even wrong to, yes, it's okay actually to call it Roman Catholicism, but never think that there was that rigidity in the notion of like today, of sclerotically categorizing the fact that there was a schism, and this is just, I don't know, waving the flag of one place rather than another, as if they had always been divided, or especially in an ecclesiastical concept, there was nothing uniting, or this division didn't come actually from something sacrilegiously connected with, at least from the more unsuccessful, less successful part, with a denial of what actually Catholic stands for. Right, there is a reason if the Byzantines had to convert, successfully retained for them just, I don't know, the Serbians, the Bulgarians, the Ruthenians, the Khazars in part. Those were the least developed parts of Europe, and actually those who manifested greater dynamism were flirting a lot with the West. Even the Ruthenians, actually, in the great Kievan Rus, was, contrarily to what was stereotyped in the Byzantine icons, and that, of course, necessary dependence on Constantinople was closer to a degree, in material terms, in political terms, institutional terms, before the Mongols, And also after, when they asked help to Rome, not to Constantinople, that couldn't really do anything because there was a Latin Empire there, from the West, mostly German, like all basically everything that was east of the Elbe. The Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, they all are more successful systems than whatever there is southeast and east of them, and they are all Roman Catholic. The same goes for the Scandinavians that actually managed to rise, even though they were smaller systems rather than just underdeveloped. They were more developed, of course, than the Eastern Europeans, or at least probably the more tribal, savage element, as it's shown also during the Northern Crusades. But it's obvious, going back to the 6th and the 7th century, that this started from these countries, Italy, Spain, and Gaul. I mean, the magnitude of the urban communication, productive, demographic net is disproportionate compared to the East. This is not even to say, because lots of people think that technology has anything to do with that. The Byzantine crop yield was pretty much the same as in the West. Also later, in the later Middle Ages, of course, the West was radically more advanced, also in technical terms. But why? Because they discovered certain things that the others were too stupid not to create themselves with 13th century technology, that it doesn't require that great genius. Of course not. The merit stands in a radically more advanced political and social system. That, however, we all tended collectively to deny, not to wanted to see. What did happen in Italy, Spain, and Gaul? But also, you can extend this to, again, what conventionally became the post-Frankish world. Because, yes, there were areas like southern Italy that were in part controlled by the Byzantines, or, as we were saying before, the Anglo-Saxon world that remained a bit more distant, a bit more connected at a point also with the Scandinavian one, right? But what conventionally becomes, at least, Italy, Spain, and Gaul, parts of Germany actually, especially the Romanized one, are the bulk. Actually, Spain not, if not for a little part, but also one very Romanized one of the Ebro Valley, it is roughly Catalonia, the bulk of the Carolingian Empire. So an empire that actually managed to challenge the same Byzantine one, and that crumbled, mostly because it is true that the establishment north of the Alps was much less, we've seen it many times, privatized. It did not really have a state in the way we intend. It took more time. The Latin-Germanic system definitely took its time to develop, but it doesn't mean, in the way of the greatest glory that far surpassed, in fact, the other one at the peak of its power in the 13th century. The Byzantine world was overrun, but that doesn't mean it was actually less advanced than the Byzantine one already during the early Middle Ages. At all, as a matter of fact. In part, you can argue again that some places were sort of less developed than some places in the Byzantine Empire, but we will see now what actually happened there and what was the Byzantine Empire. What was the interland? What were actually the demographic capacities? Because they're not equally run systems at all. If you wonder also where did that Western political and social balance come from, you can look at many indicators. For example, we do not actually know Byzantine history, the Byzantine world better than the Latin-Germanic one. Right? This is a paradox that continues over time. You would think of bigger systems apparently being more powerful to begin with. This is the same case for example, the Ottoman Empire in the Renaissance. We constantly see this as the bigger thing, mastodontic. We overly emphasize that it's a specific Western narrative. The Ottoman Empire definitely as an enemy contributed to define what we mean as Western European in a narrower sense. But it wasn't qualitatively superior to the West. That was largely divided, but in this sense not weaker than the empire. Again, do not look at the sense of, but this is politically divided. imperial power does not manifest merely because it's unitary. And it is actually unitary when you consider what Western Christendom was supposed to be, even if you studied ecclesiological history to begin with. But the power it manifests. Normally in history, you have the bigger power that is actually more powerful, so qualitatively speaking, than the ones living on the outskirts, and that are all more fragmented. Here in Europe, you see something completely different that obviously must make you look at the paradigm differently. The West, yes, it's so fragmented, it takes over the bigger system. It's not like in the migration era, where you see these peoples that were objectively more backwards that enter the system and actually get elevated civilization by this one. In the heart of the Middle Ages, like in the video I explained this for the 13th century, the West is overwhelmingly more advanced. Also in the material indicators, per capita wealth, economical, say, entrepreneurial dynamism, technology, literature, science, it's a complete myth that the Byzantine world was more literally or intellectually vibrant, right? The Westerners by that point already knew what was there in Constantinople and in the Islamic world, and they knew it so well that they went grabbing the manuscripts themselves to use them for the broader purpose that they were already about at the time. But already in the 6th and the 7th century, you can see that we actually know much more about what happened in Western Europe than what happened in the Byzantine Empire. The reason being, of course, a very different balance in the internal power. The fact that the Byzantines mostly continued that latifundium system that was in part a necessity of an empire that wanted to maintain such level of unity in terms of direct political control, but that ended up sclerotizing the system. The West, that had been part of this during late Roman times when the latifundium was the main establishment as well, broke this, rearranged it, and the Germanic system was largely contributing to this. However, still not making Italy, Spain, and Gaul Germanic countries, because they remained essentially Romans in a broader ethnocultural sense, even when they called themselves like, we are Longobards, we're Goths, we're Franks, right? I made a video also on this juridical identity shift. By the 6th century, we still have actually a great deal of Byzantine cultural output. This must never be denied, especially as military historians we appreciate the strategicon. That is perhaps probably the peak of Latin pragmatism and Hellenic intellectualism at their fullest synergy, symbiosis, effervescence, brilliancy, genius, right? From the 7th century onwards, however, the system collapses by far. They lose half of their territory, and they have to remold themselves in a way that we more concretely, it already was, let's be honest, in that sort of Eastern Roman-based reality since Constantine. Again, the Roman Empire had never been homogeneous. The Romano-Italic senators are completely different from their lower class based and copy Constantinian counterpart. Right? These are very different worlds because they have always been, since and before, of course, the Roman conquest, a very, very specific reason of military continuity. Right? Besides, of course, countries like Italy, Spain, and Gaul had been molded very differently. The Romans controlled so eastern provinces very long, but none of them became Romans. Spain and Gaul, they were also pretty big and populated in ancient times, are turned technically into Romance countries. I mean, there were languages there that belonged to another, sometimes not even Indo-European branch, like in the case of the Iberians, language that the Romans, thanks to their Italic colonization, engineer into Romance countries. In great part, as I was saying before, this had happened along the Danube. We tend to forget this. In the eastern say, divisionally speaking, part of the empire. And it's not like the Greeks had been doing anything in Byzantine times to really change this. They didn't really care, telling the truth. They controlled from Constantinople so many different peoples, especially in the Levant, right, compared to their own European background. Never forget about that specifically. But from the 7th century, you do not have in Constantinople a literature that can be equated for production, vibrancy, and general insight to the one of Latin-Germanic Europe. Constantinople does not have an Isidore of Seville, a Gregory of Tours, a Paul the Deacon, a Bede the Venerable, that tell you what was happening in their own times, in their own countries. They're telling the histories of their own people, they're telling different stories, with an actual Western criticism, which is also fascinating because we're brought to think that mentally, say intellectually, we are the children of the Greeks. And indeed, of course, Western Latin-Germanic literature in its historical becoming from Roman times was influenced by, say, Hellenic thought through how the way the Romans had also been influenced. But it is still something different. You can still already spot in Hellenism, in late antiquity, this alleged cultural superiority in literacy and whatever of the East, actually substantiating in things. Yes, there were lots of activities, commercially, etc. That brings to that level of cultural advancement and whatever. But do you think that actually we have individuals who are so involved in high culture that easily? The great libraries of the Hellenistic world were frequented by a few courtiers that read just a minimal part of that for specific purposes of celebration of the court, and really few else. The perceivedly more ignorant Romans were actually the ones frequenting libraries. Places like Rome, naturally, these were the more civilized places, but also in Italy there is a florid, also, as you know, late antique Gallic culture between the 5th, the early 6th century as well, especially in the south. It was also very intensely Romanized. And the Westerners, in their libraries, were actually active. They were mostly hearing, there were public readings, but there were relatively common people doing so. We find already, and this is notorious if you've studied paleography or codicology, a much greater level of individual autonomous writing in the West than we find in the East. The East was truly already, from a long time, under that concept of the emperor in a sort of beyond primus inter pares, the kings of kings, pharaohs, Hellenistic rulers of sort, in having maybe very developed individual centers, but ruling very large areas that were also pretty much barred from further advancement or development or autonomy. They were much more dirigistic. The Byzantine world largely continued on the wake of this. It's not just that there were Romans, the story of the latifundium, of the serfs that were abused, and so, I don't know, it's not that in the Barbaricum people actually lived better just because they had less central power. Actually, they lived much worse than that. But when you look at within the Roman world already, before this the settlement of the migration era, realize that, of course, the Byzantines have overwhelmingly that more Hellenistic bias towards autocratic domination, accompanied, by the way, by a feat that was very typical of the Hellenic culture, that did not exist in the Latin world, that is xenophobia. And not just that, but the sense that essentially as a Greek you were superior to anything and anyone, that even when the Romans actually took you over, you would still think to be living in your perfect Hellenic bubble, and nothing had happened. And much of that sort of modernistic capacity of abstraction does really come from that Hellenic mindset that, of course, is a corruption of the ancient Indo-European Dorian warrior-like heroic ethos, right? But you see, even as moderns, we celebrate that. We want, even the modernists, the contemporaries, those liberals or leftists, want to make you believe that the same Renaissance, for example, is a copy of the classical world, also without really distinguishing what this classical legacy is, because it's not like the Romans or the Greeks, in fact, were like one another. First of all, they're radically different peoples. The Romans were much more similar, say, to the Gauls than they were to the Greeks in their general cultural essentials, but also that they weren't just this highly elite, courtly, or at least very highly advanced thing that was just literally recovered, and that at least modernists would make you and emphasize all the time, because the concept of modern era is really a scam in the scanning of history about the Renaissance. That was actually the clean, pure, and fundamentally uninterrupted continuity of a large medieval civilization that did not collapse actually like the classical one at large, but simply continued on even after major civilizational crisis. And this medieval civilization was exactly the product of these countries, Western countries' accomplishments, while the Byzantines had shrank, collapsed, taken over by the Turks. Also, the Ruthenians weren't faring pretty well. Same goes for the Balkans in general, and all the places that where the Byzantines had left their mark historically and had once ruled on, and very differently from the rest of Europe that had in part even taken over some parts of formerly Byzantine-controlled territories and made them actually the hallmark like of Western civilization during the Renaissance. By that point, like Italy, even the South, like that sense of Byzantine promiscuity was completely surpassed, right? And in the previous centuries, actually that inferiority had allowed for such surpassing. Differently from, the Balkans, for example. The Balkans were taken over at some point by the Latins. They didn't have the fundamentals to be evolved into what, Islamic Spain was returned into, or what parts of even the Baltic or the Celtic fringe were turned into in the late medieval, early modern period. So it's incredibly important to be honest about this in perspective. Byzantine culture from the 7th century onwards especially starts becoming really sclerotic, self-referential. Read the Strategicon and then read Leo the Wise's Tactica. Basically, this was an emperor, in the latter case, that was copying the former work, literally letter by letter, and just adding something on his own every once in a while, notionistically, like changing, before the Strategicon talked about the hours, he was referring mostly now to the Bulgars, to the Magyars, right? This kind of things. It's just a classicistic imitation. This is what basically the Byzantine culture in some self-referential way turns into. It is true that there is actually a blossoming of Byzantine literature in the 9th and the 10th, in the following centuries, but this is absolutely not comparable, not by size, not by quality, not by general output, by any indicator to the Western one. They are also still very self-referential. They still take info and references from very specific classical models. The West has gone far beyond, while still also using classical stuff like crazy, but innovating, creating more, developing further on it. And we will see it definitely in other videos specifically dedicated to literature. What happens in the 6th, in the 7th century in Italy, in Spain, and Gaul is that the originally barbarian establishment was integrated in the Roman political institutional system. it's easy to make the case, okay, but the Germans kind of conquered these regions, like, so now we should reason in terms, they were the ones who were ruling everything and, like, you know, destroyed Rome or challenged it or substituted it in some way. No. These people start legislating in Latin. These people try to salvage as much as possible whichever Roman administration had existed up to that point. We see it in the more Romanized cases when late antiquity still existed, like among the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Burgundians. We see it among the Lombards. We see it also among the Franks, or even the Anglo-Saxons, where of course there was a possibility of doing so. So the maintenance of the local infrastructure. We're talking about that in part also, even for Anglo-Saxon and parallel sort of Arthurian Romano-Britannic Britain. We have, in this sense, also pretty extensive archaeological evidence of that. It's not like this system has not shrunk. Everybody has shrunk, right? The Byzantine Empire has essentially shrunk. The Roman Empire as well had shrunk. These systems gradually also dry up towards the second half of the 6th century, the Justinian plague. This happens everywhere. It happens in China. It happens in India. Everybody's suffering. The Barbaricum, broadly meant, is empty. All these peoples, again, had started fleeing from this misery and also killing each other, and large places there had gone underpopulated. So it's not really a prosper time for anyone involved. Here we're talking about the relative terms between one another. And there is definitely no doubt, in comparison, that while, again, the Latin-Germanic West successfully establishes countries, by the way, that will last until today. Everybody says this for the Byzantines. The Byzantine Empire lasts a millennium. Oh my God, how they made it. It's incredible. What about, I don't know, England? What about France? You can argue maybe about Spain. Italy is also not that arguable in the sense that there was a Lombarд kingdom. It basically took over almost everything from the same Byzantines that eventually became the Carolingian kingdom. It was even equated to the Frankish one by the same Charlemagne. And you see how much we have sort of self-sabotaged our own sense of ourselves. Like, we think the Byzantine Empire suddenly in non-national terms. I notice most people that are actually reviving this obsession, which is not a healthy love that exists for the Byzantines. I like very much the Byzantine Empire. I think it's fantastic. I think it's very beautiful. I think it's very interesting. It's so fascinating culturally and everything. But here we are assessing the objective differences. I notice that people tend to magnify the Byzantine Empire are very often hyper-nationalistic people, want to make hyper-nationalistic points. The idea that this was such a culture that now the West doesn't have anymore, and just in their own contemporary reality, being actually just for their own countries, not having any notion of actually that universalism that the same Byzantine Empire contained within itself. It's as if this was yet another sort of nation state, except it was not a nation state, as we will see now. The only true nation states, if you want to force that equation, are actually countries like England, Italy, Spain up to a certain bit before it's taken over by the Arabs and still there, maintaining something on its own, and Gaul. And later on also Germany. These countries lasted so much, are truly in a cultural, national sense, also existing before being politically united in a contemporary sense. They lasted more than Constantinople. They brought so much more to the world than the Byzantine Empire, that also gave a lot, no doubt. Who does ever conventionally praise this in the same way? It's done in a very specific way only for the Byzantine Empire, for Constantinople. This is a rhetorical question, but it's also, I think, quite poignant in this regard. Like, why did we even turn towards this? It's also a blend of other psychological attitudes of conspiracy theory, like they didn't teach us Byzantine history. Like, it's not that anybody in the West ever prevented you from studying the Byzantines, or literally historians that even came up with the concept of Byzantine or whatever were spitting on it. Actually, the very concept of Byzantine was created in the Protestant historiography to actually create an alter ego of Rome that would have been allegedly superior to it against Roman papacy, essentially, also in a morally superior sense, and it wasn't resumed in a depreciative sense. Right, it is true that during the Enlightenment there was some kind of that, but it wasn't really ever that. Most of the people who make these points have not even actually read the works that talk about this stuff, and know that they of course, they're not stupid sources, and surely that they are, as people, not more intelligent than people who wrote the stuff also with their own 18th century means. So we should be extremely careful about embracing these slogans, because if anything they reveal just how ignorant you are, not really what kind of historical understanding you have. And why is this West, this Latin-Germanic West, so important in this regard? Not just, as we were saying, because of all what happened later in the following centuries of overwhelming expansion and taking over basically most of the continent, basically making the Western Eurasia and North Africa revolving around such civilization in a very consistent way. I don't know, Persia did not have the same level of statehood that existed in the West by late medieval times. You can argue that it never had it, but of course the Byzantines were superior to the Persians, and they even destroyed them multiple times. I mean, the Romans pissed on the ruins of Ctesiphon multiple times, and the Persians really never ever got to Rome. At most they went to Athens before, in times in which they were also closer to that European ancestor, Indo-European ancestors list. I have more stuff incoming about the Persian wars. That's part of the reason why I reference this, but it's a good example. Because civilization is not a matter of opinion. Not only, again, the Latin-Germanic West was important for this, but because, and here we have the term of comparison, what was actually happening in the old Roman provinces of eastern Rome, along the Danube, let's say at least the lower Danube, up to the Aegean, or the Black Sea, and we should actually talk also the beyond, because there is Anatolia, and that's actually even worse, because yes, Anatolia was not as civilized, if not in the coastlands that were very Greek in that regard, but in the hinterland, no, weren't like that. Also in antiquity, that magnificent Hellenistic civilization was, again, that cool. I made some videos about some Eastern Roman provinces in classical antiquity, but we all know that the hinterland, like in the best Hellenic tradition, has nothing to do with the Hellenic identity. It wasn't a Greek word. People have this some strange idea that everybody spoke Greek. That, I don't know, in Anatolia, or mostly at large, and or in Syria, or in Egypt, or in southern Italy, people ever spoke Greek in a greater sense. The city elites of major, say, Hellenic occupied or founded cities spoke Greek. Not even the majority of the population within the city spoke Greek in those places. And surely not the hinterland peoples. Of course, there was an important influence of Greek in general. It's like saying, I don't know, what did people speak in Roman Britain? We couldn't make the example of Gaul and Spain, if not for maybe the Armorica and the northern Iberia regarding what people spoke, because in that sense, as we've seen, they had been Romanized enough. It is, again, incredibly relevant that along the Danube, the Latin tongue was still spoken, and not the Hellenic one that had always been present, say, on the next door Hellenic cities of the Black Sea, or Thrace, or Macedon, or Epirus as well. The Latins had come there, the Italics had been colonizing those places for just like a couple of hundred years. Well after there were this almost millenary contact with the Greeks in the same areas. So reflect on the difference of civilizational accomplishment between Latin Europe and Greek Europe. It's overwhelmingly important. If you don't get this, you don't get European history. And especially also the contemporary one, if you're particularly more interested in it. What was happening in this Eastern world? We've seen that in the West, we just stated, in the West, the Germans that settled at some point in the largest numbers in the hundreds of thousands, among, however, regional pools, again, of millions of, sometimes few, sometimes some millions of inhabitants. There is also this catastrophistic idea that in the West everything had gone underpopulated. Where, really? First of all, we do not really have a way to count it precisely, but we know that, of course, inhabitants were there in the millions. As we said before, actually the largest cities in the West were, in the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire even were in the West by the time of Justinian reconquest, for example. Rome, of course, was the major pool of civilizational output for all the West. It would remain easily until half of a millennium later if you account it just as a city, and obviously it was actually beyond that much of a greater influence. There was no doubt that Rome was still also connected with Constantinople to some degree, but aside from the Justinian reconquest, the papacy, I made videos on this already by the 7th century, was pretty much on its own. They had local Roman forces. They were also by the 9th century, by the same Byzantine explicit admission, lost to the Franks, but there are sources telling us, and I talked about this in the video about, I think that the significance of Charlemagne's crowning or something, maybe not, if not that video, still one with a very similar title. And not even the Longobards had ever controlled Rome. No, nobody really had. Nobody really would, even later, telling the truth. Not even at the peak of imperial disposal of Roman popes. Rome as a city was controllable because of its populace and its dynamism that nobody talks about. You see, how many videos are there on how was Rome after the fall of the Western Roman Empire? I will show you the ruins with it. And how many people actually talk about Gregory the Great? How many people talk about what Rome was, what its Senate that still existed was in the following centuries, dealing with the Longobards, dealing with the same Byzantines, dealing with the Franks? What do you think that Rome was? That everything had gone depopulated, that people were living in huts, just, yes, some were, of course, but the city was not a city anymore. That it didn't work. Do you know how many people lived there? How many people from what a range of populations lived there? And especially the Western ones: Goths, Saxons, Franks, Longobards. Do you know what the Scholai were in Rome during the early Middle Ages? Have you ever visited Rome? Do you even know, even by visiting Rome, what was actually there in a given point in history? Do you know medieval Roman history? Do you have any idea of it? Have you ever studied anywhere? Have you ever read a book? Have you ever watched even a YouTube video that explained it to you? Let's be honest. This was essentially one of the single most important centers in the world at the time. It's our world. It's the West. It's the same places we come from, and you have literally never posed yourself the problem of considering it as a central thing for your knowledge and self-development. This is heavily disturbing. Your entire identity is basically nullified by this condition, and you're completely insensitive to it. Then you wonder why civilizational collapses happen. Well, it tends to happen when these things were happening. In fact, this is the point. What was happening again in the East? What was happening in the Byzantine Empire during the terrible dark ages of the Latin-Germanic world, of people living in stinky, muddy, smoky huts, allegedly, and not taking baths in the still functioning Roman thermae. Well, while the West was Romanizing its elite, and so you have an active Romanization, imperialization, and Catholicization, to the point of having Saxon emperors defining them as metaphysically, ethnically Romans, this world of Constantinople was witnessing the diametrically opposite dynamic. Everybody knows that the Balkan, the Anatolian hinterland, was being barbarized. And we're talking about, let's stick to Europe, let's stick to the Balkans essentially. We're talking provinces that for centuries had participated up to that point to the Mediterranean civilization. Macedon, Epirus, the same Roman Balkans. I made a video about Moesia, for example. Also particularly developed, and it's a part where, in fact, that Latin tongue kept being spoken up to this point. This area was the Byzantine world. You have Greece at large also was pretty consistent civilizationally in the ancient world. This stuff gets all dried up, and not only that, we've seen that power shrinks everywhere, but the local population does not get Romanized, it gets barbarized. Now you can argue that, well, okay, these people, yes, we know that the Slavs were what we call them, were swarming into the Balkans. It wasn't even properly a capacity to stop them. Some of them settled into the Peloponnesian hinterland, where Slavic was actually spoken. We've seen it by the 13th century in the video about the Battle of Pelagonia. There were the Tsakonis. There was this historically interland reality that, to be fair, was not even fully, of course, ever Greek or whatever in antiquity. Right? Think about even the Illyrian emperors. In part, we know that these had remained like the Isaurians in Anatolia, some of the least developed and least Romanized populations that, however, saved the empire in the name of Romanization. We'll talk more about the Illyrian emperors because, again, the imperial Catholic tradition is not an opinion. Those peoples there understood that. History does not work. Okay, let's tear down the empire. No, these people understood what the empire was, and they tried themselves to preserve it as much as they could. The same Slavs who were entering the Byzantine Empire were not coming there together with the Avars, the Bulgars, other raiders, by saying, okay, we just have to destroy this thing. They were just to... some of them, would, especially the Slavs, would settle largely, and would, in fact, become Byzantine subjects, so Romaioi, if you see how in the generations they were subjects of Constantinople, sitting in the midst, say, of Greece, as we pointed out now, and not being, of course, Franks or Arabs or whatever. But were these people truly, I don't know, they were starting living like Greek people, they would start even speaking the Greek language? Hell no. Right? And this is, do you understand by scale the difference of this? Aside from the collapse of urbanism, we'll see now how Constantinople swallowed the entire rest of its dominions. By the 11th century, just Thessalonica, we've seen it also recently, was the only true city in the empire. The rest also very important towns. The now were towns, before were cities. I mean, think about Ephesus, think about Athens, think about what had been great centers like Pergamon. Like today, they do. I mean, today in the after the early Middle Ages, these are not centers. These are not the great centers of the Hellenism of even late antiquity. What cities do you think that were actually more important at the time of the Crusades? Antioch or Milan? Athens or London? Thessaloniki or Paris? You see, all these cities were more from the ancient, say, that broader Greek world were way more important, still in late antiquity, or at least, well, maybe not so much. Actually, Milan, for example, was one of those big cities already by the late antiquity. Also, even Verona, that also later on in the Middle Ages, yes, was important to a degree, but it was not one of the largest cities ever, were bigger in late antiquity than most of these other centers. What happened? What did happen in between? I mean, you see, the so-called Dark Ages happened, allegedly, in the Latin-Germanic world. What was happening in the Byzantine world? And sort of whose fault was that? At that point, it's not like the West had taken over the Byzantines. You see, that question, I don't remember if I actually phrased it before extensively, but was asking specifically again, but, did Western civilization boom because the Byzantine one declined, say the Orthodox one, that was the dreadful expression, declined? Given that in these times they were essentially in parallel, they were not really messing with one another in terms of conquest, etc., as it happens later with the Crusades and so on, it's evident that the West, it was a unitary Byzantine Empire by that point, that was also bigger, in fact, than most of these individually taken Romano-Germanic powers, was evidently doing something within itself for which, in the West instead, things were going at least far better. Also, the Byzantines have a recovery. The 8th century, the 9th century, a moment of greater recovery. Actually, during the 10th, the 11th, the Byzantines have still a lot of steam. They re-expand, whatever. But what happens to their system? Essentially, Constantinople, even just urbanly speaking, swallows everything else and atrophies it. The West is literally growing everywhere. I don't know, do you realize, I mean, to me, of course, it's now very clear from a long time, but have you, honestly, ask yourself, I even don't want to know, have you ever pictured this? Do you know magnitudinally how relevant this is? I mean, in a broader historical, do you know that the entire essence of the civilizations that you're comparing gets down to this? I mean, not just to the cities, but I mean, to all what we talk about in literally thousands of videos that I have uploaded on medieval Western history and Byzantine history, because we do cover that a lot as well. Do you think you can sort of make relativism about this? Do you think you can hide this? Think that somebody made some sort of magic trick? No. And I think that especially the aspect of Romanization and barbarization is crucial here. The Germans were not just learning how to speak Latin, and of course blending with a majority of Romance overwhelmingly larger Romance population. So yes, of course, it's not like Germans in Germany were speaking Latin, but those will actually, at least in the measure in which an elite was expressing itself in Latin formally, officially, and not because, some Roman guy had arrived and said, from now on you will do that. And the Germans say, okay, yeah, we will do it, sorry, we'll start, There was a very specific reason why writing in Latin, because it was maybe the language of civilization. You could not really have a state without what Romanity had brought with itself. And this was universally accepted. There wasn't someone, even of course, not speaking Latin and said, okay, well, we shouldn't really speak Latin. This went on for several centuries. Do you think that they didn't notice? They realized just after, oh, wow, we are expressing ourselves officially in Latin. Guess what? We could actually use vernacular. How do you think that these dynamics occur? So you have the Germans running an actual state that survives and never crashes and never evolves. In the Byzantine world, actually you have this shrinking, and you don't have, in the higher Middle Ages, a further boom of these individual elements, but if anything, just an increase in that sort of autocratic power and the provincialization of the rest, with its cleruses, for which the Latins take over, starting from the commerce, then literally conquering the empire, and need an empire that had been needing Western knights from quite a while, as you know, from the Varangian mercenaries, but also just the free Norman mercenaries, and the various many Westerners from literally everywhere in the West that were settled, say as Akritae, in the Anatolian or Balkan frontier, in all the styles that came together with that. It's disproportionate, guys. You can't unsee that. This was not happening in the West. There's not a double thread direction. East to West has been taking over, has been having the lion's share at the latest since the 12th century. At the very latest, in a way that you can say, well, but they weren't at the same scale of development anymore. Approximately, you can say that, yes, more or less as a civilization, they're comparable, but we're talking absolute terms, we're not talking relative terms. We're not talking where the former were coming from. I mean, the Latin-Germanic word was coming from to arrive doing what the Byzantines were doing once upon a time it had become. Not only this, but you don't even have this Romaioi. They're constantly bitching about them being the only Romans and saying that there was never a Roman Western Empire that actually, in the way it was established, was much more in line and in the spirit of what an archaic Roman would have thought an empire is founded like than what the Byzantines were claiming, just out of mere legal institutional continuity and not the actual metaphysical superiority of the empire. Of course, they were very powerful, so they could boast that as well, but it's not like they could deny that they didn't have the entire power of the Mediterranean and that half of Europe was actually run by people that called themselves Romans themselves. They had a Roman Pope, so the holiest actual clergy, because let's be honest, Jerusalem, aside from the fact it was lost to the Arabs and the Turks, was not really so impressive for the Westerners. In a sense, Byzantines included as Rome were. I mean, Constantinople was much more concerned about maintaining its relations with Rome and the Roman papacy than the Patriarch of Jerusalem under the Islamic rule. Or even before, for that matter. Rome was always enormously more influent in a universal sense. Again, I don't want to be repetitive, but how many times has anyone actually made you picture any of this? Just saying. Not only all of this, but while the Westerners still Romanize, hell, they managed to make the Saxons become ethnic Roman emperors by their admission, metaphysically. You have the Balkan hinterland that is basically just speaking another talk. They're not considering, I think, Romans themselves, at least in a strict sense. I mean, they're considering themselves as groups that at every good chance, like a Bulgarian invasion or whatever, start pillaging all around, coming from down the mountains. Definitely they're not the Latin-Germanic farmers and soldiers and peasants framed under the kingly or communal at some point solid political institutions with which they identify. They're mostly under this great lord of Constantinople, and they're sort of unconstitutively under its dominion and living as they can. I mean, the Balkan hinterland, let's reflect about this again, had been Romanized. There were Roman roads historically, there had been Roman cities. These things decline. Late antiquity, they do not rise again. Right? They don't. Not to the extent, of course, by any stretch of the imagination. The West does. The cities in the West do. The size of them, the numbers of them. Their interconnection, the ways, of course, they have become the centers of power, of imperial and royal power that, again, were containing, even single-handedly, the control of the Mediterranean with Constantinople. I mean, the Siculo-Normans were that much more threatening to the Byzantine Empire existence than the Seljuk Turks alone, right? They had even the Holy Roman Empire against them, allied with the Byzantines at times, and still they were that threatening. So this is the extent of how much these pieces of the West were evidently already more advanced. If we're just talking about the 11th century, of course, this didn't happen overnight. We should, of course, talk much more about the age of the second invasions, in that sense, rewiring our entire understanding of that period. It's not like the Europe was technically under siege, it was just molding power from the within, and so underdeveloped peoples from the outer side began to exploit the situation and were all beaten and pushed back, and never actually posing a serious territorial threat to any of the post-Carolingian kingdoms, if not maybe a part of the eastern part of the Eastern Frankish kingdom. It was also very similar to the guys who were on the other side, in fact, and that still won anyway. So you can argue that while the if you were to see this on a map, while the Latin-Germanic kingdoms were also politically and territorially homogeneous, the barbarian war, and so the barbarian world actually laid outside of that, right? It laid outside essentially of the Christendom in the West, because you have Romano-Germanic kingdoms with a king, with a church, with a mutual support from one another, coordination with the papacy, a districtuation, a continuity with the Roman cities district. It's all that compact. You have the barbarian world, a millennium after Pericles, extending up to the gates of Athens. Athens is not on the Danube, right? And that was the boundary of the empire, of the Byzantine Empire, still at this point. Outside of Athens, you have people speaking Slav. Of course, it's not like the Greeks had disappeared. There were also people speaking Greek in that specific context, but again, there were large communities within, say, the Peloponnese, for example, next to Sparta, say, that were speaking Slav, or even maybe Turk, because we must be serious about this. The Byzantine frontiers of this period, if they even existed, were a colander, right? This was also largely a consequence of how Constantinople had been conceived to begin with, this massive cyclopical Theodosian walls that, in fact, would last until, at least in a conventional sense, until 1453, before being outdated in a military sense, even though in 1204 the Crusaders managed to get in without destroying them. And see there who had actually called them. These are not the terrible barbarians from the West that arrive in this. Yeah, they actually, especially the French are particularly, insensitive to the functioning of the city. At least the Venetians salvaged for us to see still the beautiful works of art of Constantinople that by the time of the Ottoman conquest was sadly an empty treasure. There is no doubt about this. But this was also the result of this continuous weakening of the provincial reality. Constantinople lasts, so it can re-extend its control, especially through the sea, the other fortified centers that, even if they are just towns, they have decayed from cities, are still difficult to take from peoples like the Avars, the Bulgars, the Slavs, and many others. And so they make their work. But what is really the strength of a nation, of a people, in terms of the solidity of the demographic interland and the backbone of the country, is gradually evaporating. It's not like, actually, the Byzantines have a much different system of, for example, in the army or in administration than the West. I mean, if you look the way, for example, troops were levied, it's pretty much similar to the West. That was a bit more feudalized, focused more on the professional elite, but also the accompanying soldiers were sort of great. I mean, Western infantries also surpassed the Byzantine ones by the same period that the system overall does. And those are just subordinates of a feudal elite. You understand how much greater resources the West had comparatively, even in the social segmentation of these forces. But they are also very divided in many ways. You can make similar points about different countries, but the fact that you have this exclusive center of Constantinople, you have Anatolia from one side, the Balkans from another. In Anatolia, you have peoples that may even speak a European language because of the ancient European settlements, because of the Greek, the Roman control, and everything. But as you know, some of these territories get lost temporarily to the Arabs. There are lots of peoples that come from other places. Some are European, let's say, the European stock, like the Armenians, but say they're not really ethnically European. Also, when you look at their genetic background and also their languages are distant. I mean, does a Serb have much in common with that? Yes, you have Serbs that get deported to Anatolia because they were unruly. We've seen it in some instances. But do these parts of the empire have much to do with one another? After all, the same Roman Empire had crumbled along a provincial line. It's not much that, in fact, even in the West, the Roman Empire had disappeared because there was a joint popular vote to destroy to eliminate the imperial institution. Actually, in the West, as we know, the Pope even creates a new imperial institution, and there is actually a level of imperial power that the Franks already have and develop on their own to work with that. The empire had simply evaporated, leaving. So what is the empire? The control of these places, but the places remained. That's why we can't speak of places like England or Italy or Spain or Gaul, or that in the 6th, the 7th century, there's no such thing like Germany, let's be honest, but there would be in a couple of centuries. Identifiable as such. And it would last, right? Does the Byzantine Empire have this? It has, of course, a core of that sort of Byzantine comparticipation. There are people, of course, want some powerful ruler that makes things run and go, and mostly for safety, security. And so, of course, they participated for the Byzantines reconquer, for example, a lot of territories. There are also lots of foreign mercenaries fighting for them, so they're powerful. They get their money from their cities, from their trade routes. They're very well placed, controlling the straits, having, as we were saying before, also like productive lands. It's not like the Balkans or Anatolia were not particularly fertile or productive. It's a bit of a myth, right? If anything, it's just after the Turks, for example, take over Anatolia that there is a process of desertification, because the Byzantines had kept actually some pretty good infrastructure, aqueducts, irrigation systems, etc. However, throughout this broader period, the early Middle Ages, there is no doubt that the system had undergone a severe destabilization. Again, just imagine how you think the Byzantine Empire or the Balkans, ancient world, more or less civilized place, right? Yes, the interland is not this great much, but you have cities, you have roads, you have a general interconnections. It's an important part of the empire. Then you have a lot of barbarian invasions, especially in the east. at least in terms of repeated incursions. Like the West was at some point properly taken over, but it's not that it had undergone that level of distraction that some parts of the Danube especially had. Those had never been particularly developed to begin with. The only developed Roman province along the Danube was Moesia, right? The others were old military frontiers of some sort. And that's why also the Romans conquered Dacia, because they wanted to preserve this substantially fertile area. Then south of the Balkans, you had, of course, more fertile land. That's what essentially like the Greek world had sustained itself from. Because even if, as we've said, the Greeks did not go in the hinterland, they did not care at large, still, by controlling the portual cities, they controlled the hinterland markets. And that's also the reasons why the Byzantine Empire continues to exist, because you don't have to root for the empire just to be a farmer that sells at the local village grain that Byzantine merchants will bring to their cities that have money to pay for. And also because they control you in one way or another, sure, but because there are no other ways, right? From the Aegean side of the watershed, you have to sell as a local peasants to the Aegean cities. Where do you sell that? Otherwise, it's not convenient. So this is, of course, an important part of the story. As you know, the Byzantines do not develop actual maritime republics. If they do, it's actually in places like Amalfi, for example. Also, Monemvasia does not compare anything with the West. And as you know, it's the Latins that actually take the lead in that heavily, and the Byzantines are dependent as their own hinterland on that. And that's not a good sign. Okay, much later in the 6th and the 7th century, but the system of this barbarization, this lack of capacity in the Romanization of the system is evident. Also, why? Because the average Latin-Germanic person, of course, is not literate, it's just a peasant, whatever, but in general lives in a world that is much more literate, per capita wealthier, urbanized, and as we've seen, they're like culturally, at least autonomously dynamic, in a way that the average inhabitant of the Byzantine Empire does not witness at all. The fact that Western Europe was all organized, for example, in city districts, this was also true, again, pretty much everywhere. The Byzantines had their own city districts, even the class towns, etc. But there is not the level of civic and administrative fabric or power or autonomy that the Western cities have. As we made the example before, relatively minor cities in the West, founded by the Romans, previous Celtic oppida, are much more cities than the Byzantine towns, how they start becoming during the early Middle Ages. As we said before, these peoples in the West keep speaking Latin. Of course, in the East you have the counterpart, because they had always been speaking Greek, and yes, there had been a time in which Latin was the official language as well, was used in the administration, in the army, etc., but they had always been Greek. But the hinterland is not speaking Greek, it's speaking Slav a lot of the times. In the West you do not have this. In the West you have, as we said before, Italy, Spain, and Gaul speaking Romance. And all of Italy, all of Spain, and all of Gaul speak that. There may be a Celtic fringe, but it's fringe. It's emarginated. It's distant. Then you have the Germanic world. In England you speak essentially German. In Germany you speak German. And you, however, write in Latin. You run your administration in Latin. It's very homogeneous. The Carolingian administration had already uniformed a lot of things, starting from the pre-Greece Romano-Germanic basis that the thing progresses on. Think about universities later on. Think about, again, all these higher level of entrepreneurship. And personal education and wealth. Do you have this in the Byzantine Empire? No, you don't. You don't have, of course, it's not like everybody again in the West is, no, but there you had a cultural homogenization that is functional to a civil development. In the Byzantine Empire, you have an increasingly sclerotically private system of fundamentally predatory nature, for which you even start to need just foreign mercenaries because the local system doesn't quite work anymore, or at least it's hijacked by local lords that also do not have the capacity to oppose themselves as individual kingdoms or whatever, like to the same Westerners that invade or control the ports and all this stuff. They're in fact quite feeble overall. We've seen it even recently in the video about late medieval Thessalonica that is actually pretty developed historically, but of course it's particularly weak. It doesn't have the power that even an Italian city-state has. And of course it couldn't because it was not nearly as developed. So the question is, and it's not balanced, you see, it's not balanced, like it could even be big. It's not, Constantinople was big, but did it have the same level of entrepreneurship, of individual intellectual thriving or propulsive capacity that the West had? Like 12th, 13th century France or Italy. Maybe Constantinople taken individually is surely like an enormous civilizational spreader, but it is because just it's also a very big city, and you don't have any other like that, right? In the West you have so many others. You have the great Italian city-states are the largest ones, and you have Paris, you have Cologne, you have London, you have Barcelona, you have so many different cities that are that thriving. In the Byzantine Empire, you do not have that. Point. End of the story. And we do know that even though, for example, the Byzantine merchants were protected by the state, they didn't have the strength to oppose themselves to the Italian competitors. And of course, since the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire is basically relying just mostly on Venice or other Italian maritime republics in a trade sense, even though they had their own statally sponsored and protected and whatever merchants that are passed by the same imperial administration because the Italians are more convenient, even though they're selling part of the empire to them. And they can't really do much different because there is a power balance that does not allow them to do. And this power balance is, of course, intrinsically stemming from the fact that the West has the upper hand. That guy that asked me, but wasn't the West expanding because the East was declining? As we've seen, first of all, today, it's not like it was going simply in a directly proportional sense. Especially in the early Middle Ages, these systems were all in their own sphere, and they weren't sort of too much interfering with one another. Later, when they actually touch one another, they start clashing with one another. What kind of question is that? Of course, the West rose also because the East went down, but because they literally defeated them. And so who's the better one? Like, the West cheated because they defeated the East? How does that work? They actually won it. And they won it because there was all this pre-crest reality. Now, today I don't even have to point out the obvious of seeing how, for example, the Orthodox world was wildly underdeveloped historically from this moment onwards. I mean, just later Middle Ages, but even from before, as we've observed, for obvious reasons. If anything, just the location. Less developed lands at large, and less competitive ones, but how they remain throughout the entire rest of history of how, say, the Western Christendom was hegemonic in the continent, and how much this world was fundamentally dependent on them, including for their own salvation. Think about the Ottoman advances, or the fact that, I don't know, the Ruthenian Palatinate fell under Poland, that also wasn't like the single most overwhelmingly developed place in Europe, but still was a product of that. If you want surely Roman Catholic, but you can't say it's also partly the push from the German world that toughened them up, all right? So you see, those systems did not break. Why, for example, was, I don't know, the Byzantine Empire taken over? Of course, it was also a more important place to some extent, where this more important, Constantinople herself was that important. It wasn't much about the Anatolian or the Balkan hinterland. That was the obvious lodging of Constantinople at hand power. This is the same, of course, also in Ottoman times. But why, for example, I don't know, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth became one of the most powerful powers in Europe? It's not that, qualitatively speaking, was that advanced, as was pointed out before. It was a big system, and it did not collapse. The Mongols did not take it over, but they did take over the Ruthenian world. They made the Muscovy their bitches, and yes, they were also overrun, but because they were, savage nomads of the steppes that we constantly overrate for some reason. And there is this, of course, waves of nomadic peoples that do not help, definitely, the Eastern world to develop. It's constantly destabilized. And so still today, what you see, for example, in the post-socialist divide in Europe, it is indirectly even the consequence of the fact that it's literally the limit that the nomadic peoples for millennia hit in Europe. Right, arriving exactly to what we know as the West as well. There is not much of competition here. What I would like to stress is that even the notion of, oh my god, the Byzantines, look at their art, their culture, they were so advanced, has nothing to do with things like, in the West we did not have this. You can at most say that for the 6th century, and at that point you have to understand also what the Byzantine world is, because places like Italy, southern Gaul, southern Spain, and generally speaking had the same, right? You can have, as we were saying before, also a greater concentration when there is a more centralized government. But when you visit Constantinople today, it's not like you find all the stuff that you find in Rome. Comparatively, it's kind of obvious. Of course, the Turks have taken everything as possible from the entire surroundings, right? But I'm talking about this to show in the museums. But I'm talking about the city. The city has of course, like those important structures that, however, are mostly difficult to even identify and recognize. I mean, the Ottomans literally built on the top copy entirely on the Byzantine imperial palace, that of course was the most important thing that existed in Constantinople to begin with. The historical center is much smaller, meaning that you get a bit far away from some of the most central parts. It's already contemporary housing, right? In Rome, you have something radically different. You have literally the largest historical center in the world, loaded with an infinite amount of, in fact, ancient, medieval, modern, contemporary stuff that no other city in the world can compare with. And that's also sort of moment of Western legacy. Because whoever ruled Rome, that was largely always the Romans, and or partially this external influences, knew how to preserve Rome much more than the Byzantines managed to preserve Constantinople. What other indicators do you want? Seriously. Speaking of the 7th century, it's an incredibly dark moment for Constantinople. Actually, the West and the East, here we talk differences, but the West and let's say the Latin-Germanic and the Byzantine worlds really underwent a very common trend, chronologically speaking, in terms of ups and downs of civilization. It's important to make these distinctions, but you have also to understand that more or less things that happen in the world systemically were very similar. This is true also for when, for example, the western and the eastern halves of the empire existed. Very different outcomes, but what happened in them was technically the same. There's very little difference. It's how especially in that sense of external threat, right? Destabilization. But the outcome was different. Because obviously what matters mostly is how the local places really are. And in this sense, you cannot fail to see that what was established in the 6th, 7th century sees a relentless build-up of the West. And if anything, just a capacity to survive in Constantinople, that in order to do so and re-expand the empire and showing surely important signs of vitality, however, sacrifices the internal capacity of expansion. There are oceans of ink spilled on how and say what Constantinople should have done really in order to survive. Well, maybe you really want to look at the West, right? That's part of the story. Again, Constantinople also underwent severe stress, as we were saying before. The Byzantine Empire is definitely the receiver of so much external pressure that you can't unsee. So lots of energies and resources were spent like that. The West was more sheltered. This is admittedly true, right? It was easier in a way to say the migration era was really over by the 6th, the 7th century in Western Europe. In other countries, other things would really go differently. But you can argue that those features of Byzantine society that we highlight for most of their history, most of Byzantine history, were already founded in Constantinian times, and that actually derived from Hellenism and the particular nature of Hellenic civilization, one that had already been overrun. Let's not forget about this. The Greeks were conquered by the Romans, so definitely the West had the upper hand at some point on the East as well. The Hellenistic world at large was also a world of conquered peoples. It was not like, I don't know, the Syrians or the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians went that far without somebody else ruling them, whether the Persians, the Greeks, or the Romans, right? So the general sense here is that we're looking at an extra gear in civilizational development that we in Latin-Germanic Europe that we have completely missed at large, and that really can be appreciated in the limits of civilization. In Western Europe, civilization truly exists in the Anglo-Saxon world. It truly exists in Gaul. It truly exists in Spain. It truly exists in Italy. From the 6th to 7th century, you have Spain conquered by the Arabs, half of the Byzantine Empire conquered by the Arabs. We'll talk about that phenomenon as well. And in parallel, you have the Byzantine hinterland overrun by other peoples that settled there. The Byzantines are able to absorb in a broader sense, but that also destabilize a lot of the previous latent system that evaporates, was admittedly much less suited. I mean, lands like Italy or southern Gaul or the Spanish coast, and even Africa, right, for example, had been very, very advanced in antiquity, well before the Roman Empire, for example. The same cannot be said for, I don't know, places like today's Serbia or Romania or Bulgaria. So, of course, south of the Balkan Mountains, you don't even have too much land. You just have the Aegean and a few coastal plains that can sustain something big, and like the Greek civilization that, however, remains mainly a maritime one, a city one. It's also, I mean, Greece is also relatively small overall, right? And it lacks this interland, as we were saying before. The West, since the Roman conquest, really works in a completely different way. The Romans managed to mold the continental interland, even in exporting their own language there for good, while the East, even under their rule, is maintained just pretty much with the same fundamentals that it had remained before. And so paradoxically, this brings at the end of the western half of the empire, because these western blocks managed to go on by themselves, and the eastern ones don't. They do have an autonomy of some degree, but they do not expand. They do not have a power that really manages to simply reform from there, if not after the Arab conquest. And so we're outside not just the Roman world at that point, but from Europe, but to an important degree. Byzantines, great civilization, great empire, but without much of a strong interland at all. It's mostly a maritime connected system with, of course, an interland output, but not one as large as extended like the one in Italy, the one in Gaul, the one in, say, also what will become Germany, England, Spain later on. In individual national chunks that survive as such, that have a national culture before a political unification. A political unification that, however, is not really necessary, because medieval Europe was way more advanced when it was, for example, just different political, different polities. The Romano-Germanic map was much simpler, right? But they also had much less power compared to before. And this system is also very unitarily held together by not just the papacy, but a broader awareness of being Western European. That is something you can feel still today. I mean, whatever lays east of that is sort of way more, it's still European, of course, if you look at the essentials of the countries, no doubt. But it's much more, first of all, it's much less developed, but it's also much more fragmentary, actually. Look at the Balkans. The term Balkanized is there for a reason. Look at the issues in Eastern Europe, in the Baltic, historically, like, in part for the continuation of those threats from the East. The West lasted way more in its individual national powers, that were real powers, than Constantinople, and I think it requires a bit more of an appreciation historically under so many points of view. Naturally, this is a very important topic, so it's simply not finished here. The entire Schwerpunkt content is exemplifying what I'm talking about. This is not a topic we talk just every once in a while by chance. I'm showing you video after video why things were the case. I mean, the other day I published that video that you liked very much about the Germanic Gefolgschaft / Comitatus. Isn't it part of it? Isn't it what the Germans reinjected in the Roman Catholic world in terms of the warlike, infernal tool towards heavenly rule that in part some of the local populations had been spent, but also helped the Germans recovering through civilized organization? It's all part of it, guys. And if you don't want to see it, you're just damaging yourself and damaging others that want to know and learn what this really was about. And I don't really see any controversy with it if it wasn't for the fact that there are people who deny this because they essentially hate the West. The most ridiculous aspect of this being that they are part of the West themselves. So normally people who want to save a system that they perceive as decaying is that they fight for it. These people are just wanting to destroy that. The truth is that aside from some epiphenomenal, distorted, and disproportionate attention towards certain issues, the civilizational fundamentals of the West are still more solid than any other thing that exists in the world, even just remotely. And because, of course, the system is positive, and it's the most positive you can find in the world, and not what the celebrated people following, I don't know, misinformation about the rest of the world, because that's how it happens. They don't know anything about the rest of the world, so they think that, I don't know, they have anything better than what we have. No, they don't. They're not even close to having anything like that. Not even in their wildest dreams. Because they don't understand, they don't know what it is themselves. They are living in fear and paranoia. That's I think, under everybody's eyes. Be grateful for what you have, and you will find also the strength to protect it. Through history, you can really understand a lot of all of this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.